and let's begin. My name's Aaron Nate. I'm with Democracy Now! And thanks everybody for coming. Norman, I wanted to start by looking back. This month is the 30th anniversary of the publication of From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters. Norman, when this book came out, it was widely hailed. I don't remember well, but growing up, I do recall seeing it featured in the households of my Jewish friends. Saul Bellow gave it a great review. It was praised. You proved it to be a hoax, using faulty math and scholarship that was based on fixing the misrepresenting the original sources. Right. This is easier. So now, 30 years later, after Joan Peters, you've taken on another book, again, another book of pro-Israel apologia, My Promised Land, by Ari Shavit. And I'm wondering, looking back, how does this book compare to the Peters book?
Well, just to give a little bit of background, I know Aaron has already done so, but I'm going to fill in a few of just a few pieces. The Joan Peters book came out exactly 30 years ago this month. It was May 1984. And as Aaron mentioned, it got all of these rave reviews, not just from Saul Bellow, but from Barbara Tuchman, Lucy Dawidowich, who was a Holocaust scholar back then, Elie Wiesel, and then it got all of these, beyond the blurbs in the back of the book, it got all these rave reviews and commentary, The New Republic, and so forth. The book was a hoax, but it's one thing to think it's a hoax, and for most people who were Palestinian, it was just transparently not true that they weren't Palestinian. As Professor Said put it at the time, if you are to believe the book, then 4 million Palestinians must have gathered in the room somewhere and decide we're all going to pretend that we are Palestinian, because that's basically what the book came down to, and all these people calling themselves Palestinian were falsifying their genealogies. The two main points now of relevance to us about the book is, number one, it came out soon after the June 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And the Israeli invasion of Lebanon was Israel's first public relations debacle in the West, at least since 1967. It was a major turning point. If you want to identify exactly what it meant that after June 1982, the whole left and left liberal Jewish community, left and left liberal, but also old leftists in general, who had a warm spot in their heart for Israel, in particular because they came from an anti-fascist tradition. And being an anti-fascist back then meant being in some sense philo-Semitic. The Zionist project was largely leftist in its orientation. Its hallmarks were the kibbutzim, the labor, what was called back then labor Zionism. And so for all these reasons, there was, even as late as 1982, there was a warm spot among many liberal and left liberal Jews for Israel. The Lebanon War was a turning point. It's hard for you now to realize just how horrible that event was. When you talk about even the Gaza massacre in 2008-9, it was about 1,400 Gazans, Palestinians, who were killed. Lebanon was of a totally different order. It lasted 3.5 months, and in the course of the war, the credible estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians were killed, overwhelmingly civilians. And it was a ghastly affair. I mean, it was so ghastly that the New York Times reporter at the time was Thomas Friedman. and he was in Beirut during the bombing of Beirut in August 1982. And there was a famous incident when he said he wrote a dispatch to A.M. Rosenthal, who was the executive editor of the Times, saying the Israelis are bombing everything indiscriminately in Beirut. They've gone crazy. And his letter to the New York Times New York office was then published. I think it was by Alex Coburn at the time. And so I don't know how many of you remember the 1982 war from the U.S. The famous occasion was, and I get sort of chills down my spine when I remember it. In the New York Times, there were 2 consecutive full-page ads. My memory is Edward Said wrote the text for the ads, and it read at the top, 20,000 people killed, 160,000 made refugees. And it had a huge list of supporters. The supporters were interesting because it was the first time that Pete Seeger, he signed it. Pete was very close to Israel. Some of you may know in 1949, his first big hit, which he said on Democracy Now! A few weeks ago, it was on the top of the hit parade for 3 months, was on one side was Irene Goodnight, Irene Goodnight, and the other side was Tzena, Tzena, Tzena. It was a Hebrew song. And Pete was very close to Jews because he was an anti-fascist. So Pete Seeger was on among the signatories. Paul Robeson Jr. was among the signatories, and his father was also deeply identified with anti-fascism, which means deeply identified with the Jews. And the list goes on. I remember it quite well. I even remember the story when the first ad came out. Daniel Ellsberg was not on it, and he became enraged. Why didn't you call me? Why wasn't I on it? And so he was in the second ad. So it was the first break. It was the first break in wall-to-wall blind solidarity for Israel. And Israel took it very badly. The truth was finally aired about what goes on there. And the Joan Peters fraud, the hoax, it came out soon thereafter. So that was the context, and I think in many ways it resembles the context now where Israel is facing another crisis with American Jewry, where it's clear that at least over the last 10 years or more, the support among American Jews, in particular young American Jews, is significantly declining. The second point, which is, I think, of equal interest, the Joan Peters fraud was just ridiculous. It was stupid. Palestine was empty. Jews make the desert bloom. Arabs from neighboring states surreptitiously enter Palestine, pretend they're Palestinian, and so Palestinians have no claim to Palestine. Yeah, it was silly. But it was believed because American Jews knew practically nothing. The extent, the range of their knowledge of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's not a joke, it really was Exodus. It was some version, most of the scholarship on the Israel-Palestine conflict could be described as Exodus with footnotes. That was what scholarship consisted of. And so that particular insanity, it could fly. It could succeed, and it had a huge resonance at the time. As I said, it was a national bestseller. And here there's a distinctive difference with the present, because the Ari Shavit book, My Promised Land, it begins acknowledging all the ugliness. So the chapter that was excerpted in the New Yorker and then became the chapter most widely commented upon. The chapter starts out with, well, in 1948, we went into this place, the city called Lead, and we just expelled the entire population after committing a succession of really ugly massacres. Now, he begins that way, because he knows you can't do what you did in 1982. American Jews just know a lot more. The interesting thing is, if I just may backtrack for a moment, in the case of the Joan Peters fraud, it's quite interesting what's not stated. Peters says Palestine was empty, therefore the Jews did no wrong. But that's a backhanded acknowledgement that if Palestine had not been empty, then the Jews did something very wrong. And now Shavit has a tall order on his hands because he knows Jews now know Palestine was not empty and they were thrown out in 1948. So how do you sell Israel? How do you sell Israel when everybody knows that what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing? And so his challenge in many ways is much more formidable than the challenge that Joan Peters faced, because he has to figure out how can you justify ethnic cleansing. And that's just a very tough thing to do in an American context. Because say what you want about Americans, most every American, okay, I don't want to speak in broad generalities, most liberal Americans, which is the cohort to which most Jews belong to, most liberal Americans will acknowledge the ethnic cleansing of the United States was wrong. They don't try to prove it was right. And now Shavit is addressing an American audience, American Jews, overwhelmingly liberal, and now he has to prove that ethnic cleansing is okay. It's just not so terrible. Yeah. So he has to prove that ethnic cleansing is okay. It's just not so terrible. And as I say at the beginning of the little book I wrote on the topic, I don't think you can succeed in that. It's not possible among American Jews, which makes it a failed effort from the get-go. You're not going to convince American Jews that ethnic cleansing is okay.
Well, let's look at his argument a little bit and what he says. I'm going to quote from him. He says, "The Jewish state about to be born would not survive the external battle with the armed forces of the Arab nations if it did not rid itself of the Palestinian population that endangered it from within. If Zionism dies, Jews will be Jews again." And by that he means, at the threat of being wiped out. Lead, the Arab town that he documents being where the residents were expelled. Lead is the dirty, filthy work that enables my people to live. So two arguments there. One is that the surrounding Arab states pose an existential threat. And on a broader scale, especially after the Holocaust, the Jews had to commit this crime to establish a homeland to provide themselves with a safe haven.
Okay, I wanted to just make one more passing comment, because although the audience seems predominantly of the older age cohort, there are some young people here. The spectrum was so skewed back then that if you look at The Nation magazine in 1989, it does have an article on Lead. And it has an article on Lead by an Israeli peacenik. And how does he begin the article? He says there was nobody in Lead. It was empty when we came to Lead. And this was in 1948. The single biggest expulsion occurred in Ramleh and Lead. And as The Nation magazine reports it, there was nobody there. That was the left extreme of the mainstream spectrum, how the Israel-Palestine conflict was depicted back then. Now, the argument that Shavit makes in the book to try to justify the ethnic cleansing, it takes basically two forms. He uses the notion of, were it not for the creation of Israel, Jews would not live or would not survive. He uses it in a double sense. namely, they wouldn't survive culturally because everywhere else they were assimilating. And then he also says they wouldn't survive physically because Jews need a haven. They need a homeland in order to protect them from an ever-resurgent anti-Semitism. I don't want to address those arguments in generalities. I want to address it as Shavit himself addresses it. So Shavit says Jews, were it not for Israel, they would have assimilated everywhere else, and Jews as a people would disappear. The problem with that argument in Shavit's book is, so far as Shavit is concerned, and how he depicts Israel, or the Israel that's close to his heart, that Israel has no Jewish content at all. He describes Israel today as a shopping mall and a completely westernized society, completely emptied of any Jewish content. Now it's true by Shavit's reckoning, and also I think realistically speaking, it's true there is something you might call an Israeli culture. But judging by what Shavit himself writes, there is no Jewish culture in Israel. In fact, he's emphatic on that point, that there's no Jewish culture, at least the part of Israel he cares about. There's no Jewish culture. So you can't at one and the same time argue that Israel enables Jews to preserve their Jewish identity and at the same time claim Israel, or the Israel he cares for, has no Jewish content whatsoever. If you look at the book and read it with care, his only concern is to show that Israel, or his Israel, is as cosmopolitan as every other major metropolis in the world. So he compares Israel to New York, of course, to London, to Paris. That's his gauge. That's his standard. He's not comparing Israel, say, to other chapters in Jewish history, which don't interest him at all. He's only trying to prove that Israel, or his Israel, is as modern, as cutting edge, as jet-setty as all the other major cultural centers in the world. So that argument on his own terms, it just doesn't hang together. The other claim he makes is that Jews would not only not survive culturally, but that they also wouldn't survive physically, that Jews need Israel as a last refuge. The problem with that argument is the whole book is laced with claims that Israel is on the verge of a second Holocaust. Now, say what you want about other the Jewish diaspora, wherever it's located. It can't be said, for example, that American Jews are on the verge of a second Holocaust. It can't be said of British Jews. It can't be said of French Jews. So then again, his argument lapses into an obvious contradiction. The only place in the world, according to Shavit himself, the only place in the world where Jews are facing a potential second Holocaust, by his terms, is Israel. So how can you make the argument Jews need Israel as a haven from a second Holocaust, and then claim on every other page that the one place on earth where Jews are confronting a second Holocaust is Israel? So I don't want to argue. There are arguments, in my opinion, for what it's worth, there are arguments to be made for Jews needing a sort of what you call a last place of refuge. I can see an argument on that score, but you can't find that argument in Shavit's book. Doesn't make sense in his book.
on this point of Israel being celebrated by Shavit for being sort of this outpost of Western secularism, that also you also link that to how it's to why its prominent supporters in the U.S. are so behind it. Not because of its Jewish character, but because, as you write, it confirms that Jews stood in the front rank of Western civilization. So, how does this dynamic play out? And can you talk about this further? The reasons behind U.S. support among prominent liberal intellectuals like Alan Dershowitz, Martin Peretz, for Israel, and what their concerns are in celebrating a book like this.
The actual history of the American-Jewish relationship to Israel is not well known, and in fact I think it suffers from significant distortions, because the assumption always is American Jews being Jewish, they must have some primordial loyalty, faithfulness to Israel. There's no evidence for that, none whatsoever. If you look at the record from Israel's establishment in 1948 until 1967, Israel doesn't figure at all in American Jewish life, and there's no better testament to that fact than the foremost American Jewish sociologist, who was also a prominent sociologist, leaving aside his Jewish identity, was Nathan Glazer. Glazer might still be alive, so I shouldn't say yet. It was Nathan Glazer, and in 1957 he wrote a book called American Judaism, and he makes two observations in passing. The two observations are: Israel means nothing to American Jews, one. Two, the extermination of the Jews during World War II means nothing to American Jews. Yes, it didn't figure at all in American Jewish life. If you take, for example, the most prominent post-67 fanatical supporter of Israel, it's clearly that honor goes to Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary magazine. Podhoretz, it's an interesting case, because for those of you who are older, you'll remember that in 1967 he came out with his famous memoir. It was called Making It. It was a very vulgar memoir, which American Jews were kind of intellectual Jews were embarrassed about. You don't boast the fact that you made it in the United States and you're important. But he wrote this memoir. It's called Making It, and it's the story of his life. It's a memoir. In the whole memoir, now bear in mind it comes out in April 67, 2 months before the June 67 war. In the whole memoir, there is one sentence on Israel. Just one sentence. He mentions that the first editor of Commentary, Elliot Cohn, that Cohn had an ambivalent relationship to Zionism. That's it. And that's true across the board. If you take two other people on the left that became sort of raving Zionists after 67, the left now, dissent magazines, Irving Howe and Michael Walzer, who was already back then on the editorial board of Dissent magazine. The whole period of dissent came out in 1954. From 1954 to 1967, there were just 3 articles. The whole period, just 3 articles of Israel, one of which condemned it during the 1956 Israeli, French, British attack on Egypt. American Jews had no relationship to Israel. So what happens after 1967? Israel is now, the United States, as it came to be called, strategic asset in the Middle East. And ironically, it was a kind of paradox, which I don't think many people have written about in an intelligent way. Zionism starts off from the premise that Jews can never assimilate into the non-Jewish world, and therefore Jews have to establish a state for themselves. What happens paradoxically after 1967 is that Zionism, or support for Israel, now becomes a vehicle for American Jews to become Americanized, because Israel is on the front lines of Judeo-Christian civilization, defending the West from the Arab Third World hordes. They're actually good fighters, unlike the Americans, as it was seen back then in Vietnam, who were bad fighters. So now, by being pro-Israel, you became pro-Western and pro-American. And so it became a vehicle for American Jews, who were, as Jews, estranged in different degrees from American society. It became a vehicle for assimilation. But it had very little to do with concern about Israel. It had nothing really to do with Zionism. That's why I think all of these debates about Zionism are so beside the point. American Jews don't know about Zionism. They don't care about Zionism. They know a guy named Herzl. I think that's the beginning and the end of it. They don't. They support Israel because it gave some real rewards that enabled Jews to assimilate. And the other reason is it's just your usual ethnic chauvinism. Irish Americans support Ireland not because of Zionism, or German Americans at one point support Germany. It has nothing to do with some fancy ideology. It's a kind of ethnic ethnic loyalty. In the case of Jews, ethnic chauvinism of a fairly pronounced degree. But it had nothing to do with, in my opinion, Zionism. It had nothing to do also with the Nazi Holocaust, and it had nothing to do with being Jewish. I think these are a Jewish sense of concern for Israel. No, I don't believe that's true.
In preparation for today, I read a few interviews with Ari Shavit, and one word that came across a lot is empathy from him. Mm-hmm. He really wants to show empathy for Palestinians and their suffering. But one of his points is that he hasn't felt the same thing forthcoming from Palestinians. And I want to quote from an interview that he did with Guernica magazine from last year. And again, keep in mind that his aim here is a progressive audience. He's very clear that he wants to reach progressive Americans. He's a progressive, and he wants to reach fellow progressives. And this is what he says about Palestinians and their recognition of victimhood. Yes, Palestinians definitely deserve national rights, individual rights, everything. But I think it's legitimate to demand of them to grow up. There is a tendency in their political culture to be addicted to victimhood. At the end of the day, with all due respect, the Jews are the ultimate victims of the 20th century. And the Jews who came to Israel are amazing proof of how people do not get addicted to their victimhood. They build a future. The Jewish Zionist revenge was to live, not to kill, not to commit suicide, and not to keep telling the story of their persecution over and over again. I wish the Palestinians would learn from that side of Zionism. And he goes on, that's what the Palestinians should do now. It is my moral commitment and obligation to recognize lead, but it's their commitment to overcome it. In a sense, I did my share, they must do theirs. I wonder if you could respond to that. And does this reflect, do you think, the dominant mentality in Israel right now toward the Palestinian narrative? And how can it be overcome? Is it a matter of a new generation coming in, or are there more hopeful signs emerging right now within Israel?
Israel now, I don't mean it in a pejoratively or viciously. It's a crazy place. It's not altogether surprising that that happens when a people has convinced itself that it's under siege, and it's convinced itself it's under siege for unfair reasons, that you're being singled out, even though everybody else is guilty of those crimes too, or they so imagine. It's not altogether surprising that they act the way they do. They're very much like South Africa in the 1980s, when the South African whites were convinced that blacks are doing better in South Africa than they're doing in neighboring African countries. There's more repression in places like Romania and Eastern Europe than there is in South Africa. Some of you may recall the famous remark by Jean Kirkpatrick. I think Professor Chomsky called her the sadist in residence in the Reagan administration. She used to say that South Africa is a democracy at the top and a dictatorship at the bottom. So the South Africans acted in a kind of loony, they were really dug in, and it was a very ugly place in the 80s. There are certainly people here old enough to remember the American South during the Civil Rights Movement, and as I remember one Attorney General put it at the time, he said that describing the American South during the Civil Rights Movement, he says, that is mean country. Yes, it was very mean. It was so scary, that place during the Civil Rights Movement. And it really, the courage of the young people in particular in SNCC, it's just breathtaking. These young folks, 20, 21 years old, are going into little towns in the South where the mayor, the police, and everybody belongs to the Klan. And they're trying to sign up people to vote. It was the levels of courage are kind of mind-boggling. They're staggering. It was a very ugly place. So to say that Israel today is a very ugly place is simply to say that they have now, in their own milieu, replicating that same mentality of craziness, dug-in-ness, as in other places. And you're never going to reach them now by appeals to morals. It's just a waste of time. Now it's a battle. It's a battle. It's a battlefield, and we have to do our thing, and we have to show them that the occupation is just not worth it, and they should end it. But they're not going to end it by appeals to their morality. That, I think, is ridiculous. It's a waste of time. Just as it would have been ridiculous to appeal to the morals of white Southerners during the Civil Rights Movement. That's just not the way it was done. There were a handful of whites in the South who were okay, and that's where it began, and that's where it ended. Even in the case of South Africa, you'd be very surprised, because I was doing some research on it. As late as 1990, only 2% of South African whites supported a democratic government, including South African blacks. And the transition begins in 1991. The change came from the top. It did not come from the bottom. So it's an ugly place, but those things don't make me hopeless. It's a struggle. It's a battle to break their will, and to try to get them to, if not see reason, at least get them to calculate that this just ain't worth it. But I'm not one of those folks who thinks, oh, you know, these Israelis, we have to get rid of them, have to get rid of the state. They're so horrible, they're so terrible. People change, countries change. Not to excuse any of the other imperialist powers, but I think it's a fair statement that in the first half of the 20th century, the two most militaristic and racist countries on earth, were Germany and Japan. People know Germany, of course, but people forget. Japan, just in China, I don't know what the current estimates are, but when I studied it, in China alone they killed at least 25 million people during World War II. That was a real horror story, Japan. But if you look at the BBC World Service polls, every year the BBC does a poll, the World Service, and the poll asks the question, which countries in the world do you think have the most positive influence on international politics and the most negative influence? Negative influence, every year it's the same, on the bottom. It's always Iran, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. Always the same, those four countries at the bottom. But you'll be surprised who's always ranked 1 and 2. Depending on the year, it's either Germany or Japan that's at the top as having the most positive impact in the world. Countries can change. When I was growing up in the United States, black people were still being lynched. And in fact, contrary to the images that you sometimes get of Klansmen in their white hoods going out in the night and lynching, that wasn't what lynching was about at all. Lynchings were big festive occasions in each town. When a lynching was announced, factories were closed, children were let out from school early, everyone packed their picnic baskets, they went to the lynching, the person is lynched, then it's time to sell the body parts. You auction off the heart, the pancreas. Yes, they had auctions of the body parts. And then there were the postcards of people posing with the body parts or the person who was lynched. Not incidentally unlike during World War II with the Japanese, where people used to send home, a guy would send home to his sweetheart, a gift was a skull of a Japanese who was killed. That's a lot of cultures go through periods of complete lunacy and insanity, but I don't think it means the situation is hopeless. Right now, it's a tough battle, but I think people can change. I saw it in my own country. Just as an amusing thing, around a couple of years ago, I was watching Ironsides. Who remembers that? It was with Raymond Burr. So he plays a detective, and he has three young people as his team. One blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy, one blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman, and a black person. The black person, all he does is I should make Ironsides because he is physically disabled, he's bound to a wheelchair. So whenever they have to strategize, Raymond Burr, Ironsides, he calls over the 2 white people. We sit around and strategize what to do. The only thing the black person does is wheels around Raymond Burr. He just wheels. Or when Raymond Burr needs help, like going to the bathroom or something, he rings a buzzer, and the black person comes running out of the room in a bathrobe. That's his only role. And I remember watching it and thinking, my, how times have changed. Oh, I should point out, that was considered very progressive then. And it was the 60s and 70s. That was very progressive, Ironsides. He had a team of 3, including a black person. And then I thought to myself, my, how times have changed. The guy who's wielding Ironside is now the President of the United States. Times change. We have a tough battle now, and it's possible the battle will be lost. I can't say with certainty that I'm not of that school that where there's injustice there has to be victory at the end. No. We remember most of the victories. We remember a few of the defeats. We remember Allende's Chile. We remember that defeat. We remember... I was thinking of another one the other day. Oh, the Spanish Civil War. Everybody remembers that defeat. But most defeats are not remembered. But I think in the annals of struggle, most causes are lost. And the Palestinian one may be a lost struggle. I'm not certain it will succeed. Doesn't mean we should give up, obviously. It's a tough battle. But I don't think that battle has to include as one of its ultimate goals that Israel, this horrible, awful, God-forsaken place, has to be wiped off the map. No, I'm not of that school.
I think I saw some questions, so why don't we open it up, and we'll continue. You're my brother, so I have to skip you first. I don't want to be accused of bias. But you, sir, let's just pass this back. And Norman, I want to remind you that this mic it's not that strong, so let's hold the mic up here so everybody can hear.
I am not a pro-Zionist whatsoever. I just want to share my experience growing up. half in the suburbs of New York City on Long Island and half here in New York City, was totally pro-Zionist. I never heard any other point of view, and every synagogue that I belonged to as a kid, which were 4, there was always large support for Israel at these synagogues, and so I just needed to share that with you because I feel like pro-Zionism was alive and well when I was growing up between 1945 and 1967. I just read John Judas's book Genesis, which is all about leading up to the Truman presidency and how concerned he was with the Jewish vote, and the Jewish vote being so pro-Israel, way back then. And my older sister made Aliyah in 1986, 76, and we were surprised and not surprised. Lots of young Jews, young adult Jews, my sister's age, leaving college went to Israel at that time as the zenith of what was considered idealism at that point. None of us heard of Lid or Deir Yassin or any of the other atrocities that we did come to learn about later, and so bought the Zionist myth lock, stock, and barrel.
You want to comment, or?
I'm not sure what value is right now. Impressions from back then. I'll leave aside the thing in your sister who went to Israel in 1976, because that's already the new period. The period between, it is true, the Zionist movement was extremely effective in 1947-48 in mobilizing Jewish support, American Jewish support, for the creation of Israel. The reasons were very, very complex. One of the things the American Jewish leaders were worried about was that the refugees would come here, and they thought that would create anti-Semitism here. So they wanted to create a place where Jews can go, which is not going to complicate the situation of American Jews. But the Zionist movement was very effective in mobilizing Jewish support, and after Israel was founded, Israel just fell off the map. I understand that you have a different recollection. I've read quite a lot on the subject, and the scholarship seems to confirm my own impressions. I would also add, it wasn't only Israel that fell off the map, or fell out of the consciousness of American Jews. The Nazi Holocaust simply disappeared from American Jewish life. There was virtually nothing. Just to give you examples, when Hannah Arendt wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1963, if you look in her bibliography, which was exhaustive for its time, she could only cite 2 books in the English on the Nazi Holocaust. There was, of course, Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews, and then there was a book by Reitlinger called The SS. That was it. Nazi Holocaust didn't exist at all in American Jewish life. As a matter of fact, the famous story that Raoul Hilberg writes about in his really excellent and very moving little memoir called The Politics of Memory. He was studying at Columbia University, right over here. His advisor was the great German Jewish sociologist Franz Neumann. Neumann had written the classic study at that time of Nazism called Behemoth. Neumann is Raoul Hilberg's advisor. Hilberg goes over to him and says, I want to write a book about the destruction of European Jews during World War II. And Neumann says to Hilberg, don't do it or your career is finished. Don't do it. Because at that time, the US's main ally in Western Europe is West Germany. And West Germany, the entire bureaucracy just consists of ex-Nazis. So the last thing you want to do is bring up the ghosts of the past, of the Nazi Holocaust. And the only ones who were bringing up those ghosts were leftists and communists, because the Soviet Union obviously was what they called the revanchists in the Federal Republic of Germany. So you're accused, if you talked about the Nazi Holocaust, you're accused of being a communist on top of everything else. So that was a taboo topic. You couldn't talk about it. Nowadays, you know, if you're a survivor, it's supposedly some virtue. But when I was growing up, I have very vivid recollections. We were supposed to be ashamed. My father was in Auschwitz, my mother was in Majdanek. And you were supposed to be ashamed of your parents, because there were only two possibilities. One, that you had gone like sheep to slaughter. That was the famous phrase to describe Jews during the Nazi Holocaust, namely they were cowards. Or you must have done something dirty to survive. That's how survivors were looked at in the era before the Holocaust became an industry. I remember even late in life, people would ask my mother with genuine sympathy and curiosity, they would say, "How did you survive?" And she used to get so enraged because she thought the unstated question was, didn't you do something dirty to survive? That you couldn't have survived unless you did something dirty. But that was American Jewish life before '67. No Israel, no Holocaust.
I just wanted to say that, Norman, on the issue of taking on taboo topics, I think like Hilberg in the 80s, when you were deciding to take on Joe Peters and to disprove this notion that the Palestinians were not a people, I'm sure you had people telling you, don't do this, don't take this on. And you did pay a price for it. Okay, is there a one? Yes.
My question is, why do you think this is just going to change all by itself when there are all of these things going on and nobody actually deals with reality?
Well, I'm the last one to believe that things are going to change on their own. Frederick Douglass said, power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, it never will. And I think that's right. It's a battle. It's a struggle if you want to get things to change. I'm a resolute, though not a fanatical, I'm a resolute atheist. But nonetheless, I do believe God helps those who help themselves. Unless the Palestinians find the inner wherewithal, the strength, and it's going to require quite a lot of not just strength but sacrifice, unless and until they find that inner strength and a willingness to sacrifice, there won't be any change there. So I'm not really optimistic on that score. In the absence of a real struggle on the ground there, which then we can support, but in the absence of anything happening there, I don't think support here can change very much. The only other thing I would say is everything you describe about Israelis, you could say about Americans. When we were growing up, the West was a wilderness. It was empty. There were these savages out there who were ruining it for all the frontiersmen. When I was a kid, I'm not proud to say it, but I used to watch TV quite a lot in the 50s and early 60s, and I was always rooting for Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, born on the top of Tennessee, bravest man you ever did see, killed a bear when he was only 3, Davy. Had my coonskin cap, the whole thing. I watched Remember the Alamo. I hated Santa Anna. I wanted to kill Santa Anna. Why did he have to go to the Alamo? Why did he have to kill Jim Bowie and Lieutenant Rip Travers or whoever the hell he was? And it was one of those wrenching experiences of my childhood that we lost the Alamo. It took me a long time to learn that we were stealing Mexico. You know, and we grew up with all of those myths also. In the United States, the first film which actually treated Native Americans or depicted the reality. Does anyone know what it was? It was Little Big Men with Dustin Hoffman.
Yeah.
And that's pretty late in the day. That's the 1970s. Up until then, the depictions of Native Americans, my goodness gracious. So we all have to go through that period also, I think. But no reason to be hopeless on its account.
Okay. Who has a question about the news today? Because I want to move away from history a little bit and try to be a little bit current. So anybody?
Well, it is.
Okay, I'm gonna go to my brother. I'm looking to you for a concise question about current events.
You got it.
Okay.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Norman. This is a question about the present and about the future. You spoke about the lunacy of the state of the Jewish state right now. And the statement that Aaron read about, that Shavit said about how, Palestinians are addicted to their victimhood. I mean, that reminds me of the sentimental, progressive lunacy that I grew up with in the labor Zionist youth group that both my brother and I, sorry to out you, Aaron, grew up going to, the summer camps, the kibbutzim, all of this stuff, the indoctrination that somehow there was this deep core set of values of liberalism that we could reconcile with our Zionism. So my question for you is, in trying to, if Israel is going to persist as a country and the Palestinians aren't going to be wiped off the map, somehow that lunacy needs to be ameliorated in some way. But where is the nexus of that, where is the locus of that lunacy? Is it strictly in the occupation? If the occupation was to end tomorrow, how much of that lunacy would still be left in the unaddressed neuroses and kind of, frankly, Shavit's statement is psychotic. He can't see himself in the mirror. It's pure projection, and to me that's a dangerous kind of lunacy that bodes ill for a future in which that narrative is not called into question. I wonder what you have to say about that. And I hope that was concise enough.
You're the brother whose show I saw?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very clever with words. I'm not one of those people who thinks it's going to be a rosy tomorrow. If you end the occupation, it's one step. Israel is still closely aligned with the West. Israel doesn't think of itself as a Middle Eastern country, let alone an Eastern country. Israel thinks of itself as a European country who by accident got stuck in the Middle East. And that's not an attitude that's going to go very far in trying to learn to live with your neighbors. It's going to be tough even if and when the occupation ends. Israel still deeply aligned with the United States, still sees itself as the regional power, doesn't want any of the other regional powers, now Iran in particular, to be its rival in the region. It still has the colonial imperialist ethos. It's very deeply entrenched in Israel. So it's not going to be a pretty picture of the occupation ends, but it's something. When I was growing up, I can say, a communist with a small c, not with a big C, but there wasn't that much difference between the small c and the big C. And we all believed in the Big Bang theory of politics. There's going to be a socialist revolution, soon thereafter there'll be communism, and then there'll be the great big beautiful communist tomorrow. And that's how we envisage politics. And then I remember once I heard Pete Seeger, whose name comes up the second time this evening. I heard Pete Seeger, he performed the song Jacob's Ladder. And he said that when I used to believe in the socialist thing, the communist Big Bang, and he says, well, now I've changed my mind. I've come to see politics as being like Jacob's Ladder. We are climbing Jacob's Ladder. Every rung goes higher and higher. It's rungs. It's rungs. We make small steps, and that's really the most you can hope for. So, ending the occupation, it's a step. It would be both a world historic step and it would be a small step. It would be both at the same time. Exactly like in South Africa. Ending apartheid was a world historic victory. watching Mandela walk out of prison, you have to have a heart of stone not to have chills run down your spine. On the other hand, I meet many South Africans, and when Mandela was killed, when he died, I heard several South Africans say the same thing to me. I asked her, how do you feel? Oh, we feel terrible. We loved Nelson Mandela. And then they lean over and they whisper, but he sold us out. Both are true. It was a world historic victory, but in many respects, most people got next to nothing from it. Right now, the average South African black is worse off economically than during the apartheid era. That's just a fact. That's a statistical fact. So does that mean it was all a waste, the struggle to get rid of apartheid? No. There's no South African black person who, given the choice, would say, we want to go back. No, it was a victory. It was a huge victory. But it was also a very tiny step. And that's how I feel about the occupation. I have no illusions about if there is a day after, and I'm not certain there will be a day after. If there is a day after, I have no illusions about what that day after is going to look like. But I still believe it would be an important step.
Okay, let's take two questions at a time. Okay, so let's go, you two right here. Let's pass this back.
I understand your critique of Israel and Zionism and Shavit. What I'd like to know is, at least for tonight's discussion, is the point to express the critique, or is there something you're proposing by way of the critique? Because if there's something you're proposing, I haven't heard it.
Okay, thank you.
I have a recollection. About a decade ago, I organized a trip to bring Professor Finkelstein to my campus in Massachusetts. And while he was there, he was, of course, got the usual harassment from pro-Israel, pro-Zionist students, one of whom was an ex-roommate of mine. All of them were, very liberal. We hate the Iraq War, but, on Israel it was different. And it was, they were pretty ignorant. I mean, they were reading their own propaganda before the meeting just to try to keep track of what they were supposed to say. And during the discussion, one of them said, it wasn't right of Professor Finkelstein to take all this time saying how he's not a Holocaust denier because we never said he was. Meanwhile, they were passing out a leaflet that compared him to Ernest Zundel. And not long after this, there was another incident, that had me fuming. So I went to the faculty advisor of Hillel, who was a nice guy, liberal guy. We had differences, but we shared a healthy loathing of Alan Dershowitz, like most right-thinking human beings. And, I read him the riot act over this flyer they put out showing Israel, no occupied territories. And this was the height of the time that they were raving about Ahmadinejad's vow to allegedly wipe Israel off the map. So I was just ranting at him for a few minutes. Then, he just put his face over his hands over his face, and I felt bad because I actually liked the guy, and I thought, geez, maybe I unloaded too much. And he apologized to me and said pretty much that I was more knowledgeable about the Israel-Palestinian conflict than the kids at Hillel, that he was the nominal faculty advisor. And my question is, I'm wondering, how much of that interpretation of his, do you agree with that interpretation in regards to, the people who do defend Israel, the young people they get on campus? Do they actually, are they just ignorant dupes? Do they know what they're saying? Do they really get how schizophrenic their politics are when they, they hate, the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan, meanwhile, and are super liberal on every question in the world but Israel? So I'm just wondering if you share that impression from this Hillel advisor I spoke to.
Thank you. Wait, hold on. So again, Norman, two questions. One is what's behind blind liberal support for Israeli government policies? And then two, what are your solutions to solving the problem of occupation?
Let me just take the second question first. There's really, if you go on a college campus nowadays, aside from the hardcore of the Hillels, the hardcore of the Hillels, not the whole of the Hillels, the hardcore of the Hillels, aside from the hardcore of the Hillels, you don't find much support for Israel among American Jews on college campuses nowadays. It takes a lot more courage nowadays to be supportive of Israel than to be supportive of Palestinians on a college campus. There's a lot of, in my opinion, false posing and posturing about what courage and bravery it takes now to speak out against Israel. I mean, that's just all laughable. There was a time where it required courage. So if you were at Columbia University in the 1970s when Professor Said was here, his office was firebombed. There were people in the basement out to get him. He had to have FBI protection. It was a serious thing if you spoke out in support of Israel, in support of the Palestinians. I remember after the June '82 war, I belonged to a little group of Meshuggah Jews, I have to say. It was called JAMO, Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon. And we had a button, and the button said, JAMO, Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon. And I remember every morning I had this crisis of conscience. Am I going to wear this button? Because I was terrified of standing on the subway platform because I figured somebody's going to shove me. It was really sort of scary back then. But during the '82 war, I had a poster that it said, this son of survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Majdanek, and Auschwitz concentration camps will not be silent. Israeli Nazis stopped the massacre in Lebanon. It took a long time to write it all out. And I remember when I would stand outside the Israeli consulate on 2nd Avenue and between 43rd Street, people next to me used to say, Norman, hold it up higher. Hold it. You hold it up higher. I was completely terrified. But nowadays it's not like that. It takes, a zero amount of courage. There is a hardcore, which is really pretty creepy, I have to say. My friend here, Maren Rosen, I was invited to speak at a Jewish organization at Yale. And I decided to bring her along. And she's of mixed background, but part of her background is Lebanese. And I was just shocked at how crude and vulgar these kids were. It really was surprising to me. During the evening, and they were really vicious to Maren, who's very cultured and refined. And so I was completely off-put, and at the end, they had gone around the room, I forgot what the reason was, in praising their parents. And at the end, as I was walking out, I turned to them and I said, it's very touching, the warm feelings you have for your parents, but didn't any of them teach you manners? I was just really appalled by the way they carried on, but I can't say that's typical. The YouTube of me that's the most famous is the one where I have that exchange with that woman at Waterloo University, and I didn't like that particular YouTube because it's just not representative of the last 10 years. When I speak now, it's just very calm. They're no longer the demonstrations and the hysteria. American Jews, young people in particular, they're really not going to defend that sort of craziness. They're liberal, they're young, they're idealistic. So in 2006, Israel attacks Lebanon. In the last 3 days of the war, the last 72 hours, the war is already over. The UN has, the U.S., Condoleezza Rice stopped vetoing the UN resolution. The war is over. They just have to implement it on the ground. In the last 72 hours, Israel dropped 4 million 4 million cluster bomblets on South Lebanon. 4 million. You go on a college campus, no, I don't want to say no, none, but the tiniest handful of American Jews are going to defend that. It just doesn't happen. 2008-9, Israel invades Gaza, drops white phosphorus, which reaches a temperature of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It drops white phosphorus on a school, a hospital, a humanitarian warehouse. American Jews are not going to defend that. You know, if you're Dick Cheney's son or Sean Hannity's daughter or whatever, freak, I don't know. Maybe they'll defend it, but American Jews don't. They just don't do that. So I don't see that as an obstacle now. But there is a red line. If you talk about abolishing Israel, yes, they're going to defend it. That's a red line. So if you want to reach American Jews, if that's part of your political agenda, then being quote-unquote agnostic on Israel's existence, that's a non-starter, even among the most liberal of American Jews. It's not going to happen. You're not going to reach them. Now, you may say, I don't care if I reach them. That's fine. But don't pretend you're trying to reach American Jews and say you have no position on Israel. That doesn't make any sense.
This gets to solutions, yes.
As to your question, I'm right now writing a book with a Palestinian comrade of mine, entitled How to Resolve the Israel-Palestine Conflict, which attempts to address the concern of yours. I would just say right now, because I don't think you'd be here if you aren't political people. I'm a political person, so we should say something about what's going on right now. We're in a very charged situation right now. If you read the interview with Nahum Barnea, Israel's leading correspondent, he interviewed the key American negotiators during the Kerry process. And the interview makes clear the Palestinians gave away on everything. He said that the Palestinians accepted, during the negotiations, the Palestinians accepted that 80% of the settlers will remain in place. 80% of the settlers remaining in place means that Israel will keep all the major settlement blocks. And that means there's not much left of a Palestinian territory. Then he said the Palestinians accepted that Israel will keep all the Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem. That means that the Palestinians accepted the route of the wall in East Jerusalem, which means they'll get nothing in East Jerusalem. And the Palestinians accepted that Israel will have a veto on the refugee issue. So basically, the Palestinians gave away the house. But the Israelis still wouldn't budge. Kerry went into these so-called negotiations. His strategy was very straightforward. His strategy was, he looks at the documentary record and he says, okay, what's Israel's bottom line? What does it want? If you look at the documentary record, which I've examined because it came out in the form of the Palestine papers, they wanted to keep 10% of the West Bank. They wanted nullification of the refugee question. That was their two main demands. Keep the settlement blocks, about 10% of the West Bank, and nullify the refugee question and the right of return. So Kerry figures, okay, I'm going to go into the negotiations with the Israeli bottom line, its core demands. I'll force the Palestinians to capitulate because they're so weak right now. They'll have to capitulate. And lo and behold, what happened? Martin Indyk, Kerry, the whole crowd, they go in, they bring along Israel's core demands. Palestinians predictably accept it, but Israel says no. So now the Americans are furious. We just spent 9 months negotiating. We got everything that you wanted, and you're saying no? So now the Americans are furious, and they gave an interview to Barnea, but they're saying it all over the place. They're putting all the blame on Israel. And so you have now, at this particular moment, a gap has opened up between the Americans and the Israelis, because the Americans are so angry. Here are Israel's chief apologists, these crooks like Martin Indyk. They do all of Israel's dirty work, and Israel still says no. So basically, what it looks like now is going to happen is, number one, Kerry is going to put on the table, this is what I won for you. As he says, he's going to reveal exactly what was agreed upon so far. So he's going to show the Israelis, the population now, not the leadership, the population. We won all of this for you. It's won. It's a done deal. And then they've been hinting in the last few days, they're going to let the EU and the UN start working on Israel. They keep saying, now, you're going to have trouble, Israel, because the EU and the UN are going to be on your case. So he's hoping that he'll put the deal out there, have the EU and the UN turn some screws on Israel, put some pressure on them, and then the Israelis will decide, well, let's accept the deal. That's what he's hoping will happen. So you have, to use that cliche, you have a crisis and an opportunity now. The crisis is, if Kerry's strategy works and the Israelis accept the Kerry plan, the Palestinians are in an impossible situation because they already accepted it. So Kerry goes over to the Palestinians and says, I got Israel to agree, so now we have a deal. How do they say we don't have a deal? They already agreed to all of Israel's terms. The opportunity is, there is a significant but temporary break now between the U.S. and Israel. There's a lot of anger by Kerry, Indyk, everyone. There's a lot of anger. It's the greatest opportunity for the Palestinians to exploit. Because it is a possibility, for example, if the UN decides, the Security Council decides to condemn Israel for the settlements, it's possible the US will move from the nay column to the abstain column, because they're so angry now. And also because they want to put the pressure on Israel to accept the deal. So Palestinians have a real opportunity now, because the US is signaling, we're not going to back Israel. We're going to let the EU and the UN work their magic, put the pressure on Israel, but they're doing it because they want Israel to accept the Kerry plan. And the Kerry plan is a disaster for the Palestinians. So it's a very tough situation now. It's the one possibility is the Palestinians go into resistance mode, engage in mass nonviolent resistance, momentum builds. Israel says, okay, we accept the Kerry plan. Kerry goes to a boss, and the boss says, I can't do anything. The Palestinians don't accept it.
But Professor, that's the analysis, and you've given the critique, and it's fine, no objection for analysis for its own sake and critique for its own sake. My question is that what you're offering, or are you offering a proposal that builds on the critique and the analysis?
I've said
because I'm not sure.
I've said
while
a thousand.
Okay with there being a critique and analysis for its own sake, I don't understand the point.
Right, I've said 1,000 times, and now is not the time to reiterate it, because I think for those people who have heard me speak on the subject, it's going to bore them to the point of tedium and tears. In my view, the only strategy that can work is mass nonviolent Palestinian resistance under the slogan of our rights under international law, no less, no more. I think if the Palestinians rally under the slogan of our rights under international law, exclamation point, no less, no more. I think it puts, first of all, I think it's very hard for American Jews to say no to that. That's just part of being liberal. It's very hard for them to say no to that. It'll be very hard for Obama to say no to that. It's the one thing which I think can isolate Israel. But if you start dreaming up programs which are not anchored in international law, I don't think they have a snowball's chance in hell of succeeding, which has always been my criticism of the BDS. The BDS says it's anchored in international law, which I think is absolutely correct. But then when they say on the question of Israel, they say we take no position, which doesn't make any sense as a political stance. Israel is a state under international law. How can you say Palestinians have the right to self-determination and statehood, which they do? It's international law. But Israelis have the reciprocal right to self-determination and statehood. That's why they're in the United Nations. That's the law. So you can't have a program, you can't, with the law, you can't pick and choose. It's like saying I have the right to walk at the green, but I'm agnostic on the red. If you have a right to walk at the green, it's because you have an obligation to stop at the red. Law is a package deal. Now, Palestinians say, or their supporters say, our program is anchored in international law, and under international law, Palestinians have the right to self-determination and statehood. That's absolutely correct. But then how could you say you're agnostic on Israel? Under international law, Israel also has the right to self-determination and statehood. If you organize a movement under the principle of demanding your rights under international law, I think that can work. I think it can succeed. In fact, I'm absolutely certain of it. As certain as I am of anything in politics, it has real prospects for success. But the thing is, it has to come from there. To just take an obvious analogy, because BDS makes all of these claims about how it's going to liberate Palestine. It doesn't make any sense to me. Take the case of the civil rights movement. So everybody knows, in 1960, 61, begin the sit-ins at the Woolworths, the lunch counters in the South. Young black folks go to the lunch counters, demand to be served. They get hit over the head, they get beaten, really brutal sort of stuff. And then, what do white folks in the North start to do? They do their own version of BDS. They start picketing Woolworths in the North and say that your franchises in the South, they're guilty of segregation, brutal tactics, so we're demanding a boycott, the BDS, we're demanding a boycott of Woolworths in the North. But what if white folks in the North demanded a boycott, but nobody was sitting in the lunch counters in the South? How far would the boycott go? We're a solidarity movement. We're solidarity with the people struggling there. But if they're not struggling there, there's really not much we can do here. I mean, it's just a fact of life. Because the public thinks, what does the public think? They see a boycott in the 60s, or they see us with BDS now, and the public thinks, hey, if things are really so bad, why aren't they doing anything there? And if they're not doing anything, it's probably because it's not so bad. So it has to start there. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. But if it starts there, the Palestine movement has so many advantages over any other movement in the world. You walk onto a college campus. Is there any other organized cause on a college campus except Palestine nowadays? There is not. Palestine is it. They have a whole network all around the world. They have so many dedicated activists, so many people ready to give their all. There's a real prospect there if something happens there, but it has to start there.
Norman, I just wanted to say that on that note, what's striking to me about that interview with the American official talking about the collapse of the Kerry talks is that he seems to share your analysis of the hopes for an intifada. He says, quote, I guess we need another intifada to create the circumstances that would allow for progress. Which is quite amazing. Okay, we have time for one more question. Who wants that burden?
I just want to briefly comment on that. The problem is the American official wants the third intifada in order to put enough pressure on Israel that it capitulates to the Kerry plan. And that's the problem. Because the moment the Israelis capitulate to the Kerry plan, then the Americans say, okay, they go to the Palestinians, it's a done deal. And if the Palestinians say no, the Americans say, what do you mean no? You accepted it already. So it's a very tough situation now, and it requires a lot of political cleverness to figure out how to navigate in these waters.
So we should be especially wary of Israel's next compromise. Kind of like the disengagement from
yeah,
Gaza,
it could
right?
be a disaster.
Yeah. Okay. One more question.
That's
Let's go to you,
exactly
sir.
right.
First of all, happy Nakba Day, or Yom HaAtzmaut, as you will. And so last summer I was in Israel, and I was driving with my parents through Jerusalem along the highway next to the separation barrier. And we were looking at the separation barrier and thinking, we were thinking basically what you said. If the Palestinians marched to the separation barrier with signs, they could put your slogan on it, they would have a state tomorrow. So why do you think that isn't happening?
Tomorrow, Norman. Tomorrow.
Well, first of all, I've been saying that for the past couple of years, because July 2004 was when the International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion, found that the wall that Israel has been building in the occupied Palestinian territory in the West Bank is illegal under international law. That was finding number one. Finding number two was the wall has to be dismantled. And finding number three was the international community has a responsibility to see that the wall is dismantled. So we're now this July, in a couple of months, we're heading toward the 10th anniversary. It's the perfect opportunity of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion declaring the wall illegal. It is a tremendous possibility, and I've, my small way with my friend Sana Qasim, my website master, and all sorts of things. We made videos trying to convince people to do it. The reasons why, there's no mystery. Palestinians, for now, they've given up. There have been many struggles, huge amounts of sacrifice, and they didn't see anything come of it. So, when you keep sacrificing, you keep hoping. There was a first intifada, then there were the illusions, unfortunately, of the Oslo peace process. There was a second intifada, and all the Palestinians got for it was more land lost, more settlers, a corrupt leadership. They didn't see any gains from it.
Well, you
and
don't
so,
win over international opinion by throwing rocks. You win it over with your slogan.
If you ask my opinion, yes, I wish they found the inner strength not to throw the stones, because it just gives new propaganda for Israel. But let's be realistic about these stones. I was in the occupied territories during the first intifada. There was only one case in the 6 years of an Israeli soldier who was killed by a stone. And that's when a Palestinian on a roof dropped a very heavy rock on a soldier. That was it. For anybody who was there, the stones never even reached the soldiers. They were purely symbolic. You're throwing the stone at a soldier who is so far away, who's firing a rifle. But if you ask my opinion, yes. I wish they could find that inner strength, and it does take a lot of inner strength to absorb all the blows, and all the repression and the torture and everything, and to stay nonviolent. It's very tough. I wish they could do it, but I don't fault them if they can't. I can perfectly well understand what motivates the anger, and if the maximum expression of that anger is throwing a stone, then the Palestinians are showing Herculean self-restraint as compared to anyone else. But I think the strategy, I'm absolutely convinced that the strategy can win, and it actually would not be much different than the strategy that was tested in the civil rights movement in the United States. I'm optimistic. It's late in the day now. We're already in May, but maybe they'll still attempt it in July. One of the tragedies of the whole conflict is that Palestinians just don't exploit their victories. If you take the case of every single person in this room, has heard of the Balfour Declaration. Okay, that was 100 years ago. It was just one sentence by a nondescript British foreign minister. But everybody knows it. Everybody here knows the partition resolution. That was just one of, at this point, several thousand General Assembly recommendations. But everybody knows it. Why does everybody know the Balfour Declaration? Why does everyone know the partition resolution? They know it because the Zionist movement made sure everybody knows it. Because these were its deeds of legitimacy. As Abba Eban said in 1948, the Israeli foreign minister, or at that point he was the UN ambassador, he said the partition resolution is our birth certificate. But when it comes to the Palestinian victories, of which the International Court of Justice opinion in 2004 was a very significant one, nobody knows them. They're just dispatched to history, or dispatched under the rug. And these victories, the irony is, when the International Court of Justice was about to render its advisory opinion, Israel was in a panic. It was terrified that the International Court of Justice was going to decide against them, and it's going to cause them a huge amount of problems. And they couldn't decide whether they will or they won't attend the hearings in The Hague. They decided to attend the first half, what's called the jurisdictional issue, but not the second half, the actual adjudication. They were terrified of it, and in fact it turned out they had nothing to be afraid of, because the Palestinians didn't do anything with it. I think if they showed some wisdom, shrewdness, and the Palestinians can overcome that defeatism that's now plaguing them, then I think prospects are good. No certainty, but there's nothing certain in politics, but the prospects are good.
I want to thank Norman. The book is Old Wine, Broken Bottle. You can buy copies here. We're also selling more of Norman's books too. Please pick up copies. Norman, are you going to sign books?
Of course.
Norman will stick around and sign books for you. Thanks for coming.